My name is Henry Collins, and every time someone asks me why I still walk my fields after every heavy rain, even though I'm well into my 80s and my knees aren't nearly as strong as they used to be, I simply smile because they don't know what happened during the spring of 1976. They see an old farmer stopping beside drainage ditches, running handfuls of soil through weathered fingers, checking fence posts, and staring quietly toward the creek that winds across the southern edge of my property. But they don't realize those little habits were born from one week that changed my life forever. Some people remember 1976 for the music, the politics, or the celebrations happening across America. I remember it because I honestly believed I was about to lose everything my family had spent 3 generations building. Even now, nearly 50 years later, I can still close my eyes and hear the roar of that water, smell the wet earth carried by the flood, and remember standing on my porch wondering whether sunrise would reveal a farm or nothing but mud and heartbreak. Back then, I was 36 years old with a wife named Eleanor, 2 young boys who believed tractors were the greatest machines ever built, and a modest 140-acre farm just outside Hartwell County, Missouri. We weren't wealthy by any measure. Every dollar we earned came from long days behind machinery, careful planning, and more prayers than I'd probably admitted to anyone at the time. The farmhouse wasn't fancy. Its white paint had begun peeling beneath years of harsh summers. The red barn leaned ever so slightly toward the east after surviving countless storms, and the gravel driveway developed fresh potholes every spring no matter how many times I filled them. But to us, it wasn't just a farm. It was home. My father had been born there. My grandfather had broken that ground with horses before tractors ever reached our county. Every fence line carried stories. Every field had a name. Every oak tree seemed to remember someone from our family. That spring had begun beautifully. Winter melted away earlier than expected, leaving dark, rich soil that promised one of the finest planting seasons we'd seen in years. The wheat stood healthy. The cornfields had been prepared ahead of schedule, and my neighbors spent mornings waving from tractors as if the entire county had finally been rewarded after several difficult seasons. Even the creek that crossed my property looked peaceful, flowing gently enough for the boys to skip rocks across its surface after school. If someone had told me then that within a few weeks that same creek would become the greatest threat our valley had ever faced, I would have laughed and offered them another cup of coffee. The weather changed so gradually that almost nobody noticed at first. Small showers became steady rains. Steady rains became days of gray skies that never seemed to end. Every morning, I stepped onto the porch hoping to see sunshine breaking through the clouds, only to find another curtain of rain stretching across the hills. At first, we welcomed it, because every farmer knows spring moisture usually means healthy crops. But by the end of the first week, the ground had stopped absorbing water. Tractor tires began sinking into fields that normally stayed firm. The creek widened until it swallowed patches of grass along its banks. Fence posts closest to the water disappeared beneath muddy currents. Neighbors started talking less about planting schedules and more about weather forecasts. Then came the warning. I remember hearing it on the old battery-powered radio, sitting beside the kitchen window. The announcer's voice sounded unusually serious as he explained that several rivers throughout Missouri were rising rapidly after days of relentless rainfall farther north. Communities downstream were already preparing for possible evacuations, and farmers living near creeks and floodplains were advised to move livestock to higher ground immediately. Eleanor looked at me without saying a word because we both knew what those warnings meant. Our farm had survived heavy rain before, but this felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual. That afternoon, every neighbor worked as though daylight itself had become precious. Cattle were moved uphill. Equipment was parked on higher ground. Hay bales were relocated into the loft. My boys, though still too young to understand the danger completely, carried tools and ropes with all the determination little boys can manage when they want to help their father. Looking back, I realized we weren't simply preparing the farm. We were preparing ourselves for a fight against something none of us could control. By the third night, the rain became almost impossible to describe. It no longer sounded like ordinary rainfall tapping gently against the roof. It crashed against the house with such force that conversation inside became difficult. Wind bent the old oak trees until I feared they might snap in half. Lightning flashed so frequently that darkness hardly existed anymore. Every few minutes, I stepped outside with a lantern just to check the creek, and each time it had climbed higher than before. Water that normally stayed 50 yards away had reached the edge of my lower pasture. The current carried branches, fence rails, and entire tree trunks that spun through the darkness like tiny sticks. I had lived beside that creek my entire life, yet I had never seen it angry. Around midnight, someone began pounding on the front door. It was my closest neighbor, Walter Jenkins. His clothes were soaked through. Mud covered his boots nearly to the knees, and I could barely hear him over the storm. "The bridge is gone," he shouted. I stared at him. Gone. The whole bridge. The water took it. Those words sent a chill through me unlike anything I had ever felt. That bridge had stood for decades. If the flood possessed enough force to carry away solid timber and steel, then nothing in the valley was truly safe anymore. Before dawn, another frightening report reached us. Farms upstream had already begun disappearing beneath floodwater. Families were abandoning homes with only minutes to spare. Livestock wandered wherever higher ground remained. Roads vanished beneath muddy currents so quickly that rescue crews struggled to reach isolated properties. Standing on my porch with rain running off the brim of my hat, I watched the creek burst beyond its banks and spread across the lower fields with terrifying speed. It no longer looked like a creek. It looked like an enormous brown river swallowing everything in its path. And that was the moment I noticed something that made my heart stop. The flood wasn't moving toward my lower pasture anymore. It was moving directly toward my farmhouse. If you've stayed with me this far, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who believes courage often begins with simply refusing to give up. Stay with me, because when the sun finally rose over Hartwell County the next morning, I found myself facing a decision that would determine whether my family lost everything or whether our farm would somehow survive one of the greatest floods our county had ever known. When I saw that wall of muddy water moving toward my farmhouse, I didn't feel brave. People often tell stories afterward as though they never experienced fear, but that's simply not true. I was terrified. My wife Eleanor stood beside me holding her youngest son, while our oldest clung tightly to my arm. And for a few seconds, all four of us simply stared across the fields in complete silence as years of hard work slowly disappeared beneath the flood. Fence posts vanished one after another. Hay bales floated away like toys. Sections of cornfield disappeared beneath swirling brown water until I could no longer tell where the creek ended and my farmland began. The roar of the current was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't just the sound of water. It sounded as though the earth itself had decided to move. Every instinct inside me wanted to panic, but I knew that if I lost my composure, my family would lose theirs as well. So I took a deep breath, looked at Eleanor, and quietly said, "Whatever happens today, we stay together." Within minutes, several neighbors arrived in tractors from the higher part of the valley. Nobody cared whose property ended where or whose equipment was newer. In moments like that, there were no property lines, only people trying to save one another. We worked as quickly as we could, moving the remaining cattle toward the highest hill on my farm while others secured fuel tanks, loaded feed onto trailers, and carried supplies into the upstairs rooms of the farmhouse. The rain continued falling so heavily that it soaked us within seconds, yet nobody complained. We simply kept working because that is what farmers do when there is still work left to be done. Looking back now, I realize those hours reminded me that the strongest crop any community can ever grow is not corn or wheat. It is neighbors who refuse to abandon one another when life becomes difficult. By midday, the flood had reached the yard. Water rushed around the tractor shed, climbed halfway up the porch steps, and surrounded the old barn that my grandfather had built with his own hands. I honestly believed we were about to watch it collapse. Every few minutes, another tree, another fence rail, or another piece of somebody else's property crashed past in the current. We could do nothing except stand there and pray. Then something happened that none of us expected. Years earlier, long before I inherited the farm, my grandfather had spent countless evenings digging shallow drainage channels across the western pasture. Many people thought he was wasting his time because those little ditches seemed far too small to matter. I remember neighbors teasing him, asking why an old man was working so hard with nothing but a shovel when modern equipment could have done the job faster. Grandpa would simply smile and keep digging. He used to tell me that water always wanted somewhere to go, and if you respected it instead of fighting it, it might spare you when the worst storms came. Standing there in 1976, I watched those forgotten channels begin doing exactly what he had always believed they would. Instead of allowing the flood to strike the farmhouse directly, they quietly redirected enormous amounts of water toward lower grazing areas that could recover later. The current divided. Some flowed around the house instead of through it. Other sections slowed enough to prevent the soil beneath the foundation from washing away. It wasn't a miracle in the sense that the flood suddenly disappeared. Water still covered much of the property, and we still lost fences, crops, and equipment. But those simple drainage paths carved by one stubborn farmer decades earlier made the difference between terrible damage and complete destruction. At that moment, I finally understood why Grandpa always said that caring for the land meant thinking about people you might never meet. He hadn't built those channels for himself. He had built them for me without ever knowing this day would come. The rain finally stopped sometime during the night. Morning arrived quietly, almost as though the storm had exhausted itself. When I stepped outside, the valley looked completely different from the one I remembered. Mud-covered roads. Fields resembled lakes. Debris hung from tree branches several feet above the ground, showing just how high the water had risen. As the flood slowly retreated, the true extent of the damage became visible. Several neighboring barns had collapsed. Bridges were gone. Miles of fencing had disappeared. Crops that had looked so promising only days earlier now lay buried beneath thick layers of silt. My heart broke for every family facing the enormous task of starting over. Yet as I walked across my own property, I realized our farmhouse was still standing exactly where my grandfather had built it. The barn, though damaged, remained upright. The livestock had survived. We had lost much, but we had not lost everything. Over the following weeks, something beautiful happened across Hartwell County. Farmers who had been spared the worst damage showed up without being asked to help those who had lost nearly everything. Tractors cleared roads before county crews could arrive. Churches cooked meals for exhausted families. Teenagers repaired fences alongside men old enough to be their grandfathers. Nobody asked who could pay. Nobody kept score. We simply remembered that hard seasons never last forever, but the way people treat each other during those seasons is remembered for generations. Our own farm became a gathering place where neighbors stored equipment, sheltered livestock, and shared whatever supplies we had left. Looking around the yard each evening, I realized that although the flood had taken many things, it had also revealed something priceless. It showed us that communities built on kindness are far stronger than communities built only on convenience. A few months later, an engineer from the state visited my farm to study those old drainage channels. After walking the property for most of the afternoon, he shook my hand and said he believed my grandfather had unknowingly applied principles that modern soil conservation experts were encouraging across the country. Hearing those words filled me with quiet pride. Grandpa had never attended college. He was an engineer. He simply knew his land because he had walked every acre of it for decades. Sometimes wisdom comes from books. Other times it comes from paying close attention to the ground beneath your feet. Nearly 50 years have passed since that flood, and I still begin many mornings by walking the same fields. Some of the oak trees planted after the storm now tower over the pasture. The drainage channels are wider and stronger than they once were, carefully maintained every year because I know firsthand what neglect can cost. My sons now bring my grandchildren to the farm, and every spring they ask why I insist on checking every ditch after heavy rain. I always smile before telling them the story you've just heard. Then I take them to the western pasture, point toward those quiet channels, and explain that the most important work we ever do is often the work nobody notices until the day it saves them. If you stayed with me until the end of my story, thank you for spending this time with me. I hope it reminds you that preparation is never wasted, kindness is never forgotten, and the smallest acts of wisdom can protect generations yet to come. If you enjoyed listening, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who believes perseverance still matters. And wherever life finds you today, I wish you strong foundations when storms arrive, faithful friends when the road becomes difficult, peaceful days after every season of struggle, and a heart that never loses hope. May God bless you, your family, and every field you call home. Until next time, take care of yourself and those you love.